Jimmy, thank you for reading. That's two times here lately that you've had extended versions that you've had to read there. I, 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 I apologize for that. I will say that it's kind of difficult to pick a reading for Wednesday night because if you'll notice, usually on Sunday morning and Sunday evening, the reading is sort of a prep for what we're going to study that night. But on Sunday morning and Sunday evening, there's usually, but as we've talked about, most of these are only about 3 or 4 verses. And I feel like if the scripture reading was that, then we'd just be done and we'd go home. So it's kind of hard to pick a reading. But what Jimmy read tonight there really was, it was a lot of verses to get to the last one. And the last one there in James chapter 2, in verse, I believe it was 26, was the last one. It says, "For as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also." We're going to talk about tonight another miracle, and we're going to be talking about the daughter of Jairus being raised. And so I wanted to get to that body without spirit part there at the end of James chapter 2. Tonight is a very odd situation because we are going to mostly be in Mark chapter 5. It seems like Mark is where we focus on a lot with these rather than Matthew or Luke. But tonight is going to be a sort of rare instance where there's a miracle happens inside of another miracle. It was two different, they're two separate things, but Jesus sort of starts the process of Jairus' daughter, and then there's another event that happens sort of in between, and then they go on to it. I thought about maybe trying to do 2 in 1. I think that's going to be complicated. And so what I want you to know is tonight is Jesus healing Jairus' daughter, but there's also the woman with the issue of blood sort of in between. And we're going to make a reference to that just to sort of get to the end. But then next week, when we talk about the woman with the issue of blood, I'll need you to remember the story of Jairus' daughter, okay? So we're kind of comboing 2 into 1 for this. I don't know what the best way to do it is, and I've not even prepared next week's anyway. We'll see how it goes. Anyway, but I just want you to know, like, wait, why did we jump over that? Well, there's a for it. Tonight we're talking about the daughter of Jairus being raised. And we've spent the last couple of weeks sort of in and around the Sea of Galilee. And we talked a couple of weeks ago about they went across the Sea of Galilee and then they've returned back. And so we're in Mark chapter 5, and Jesus and his disciples have returned to Capernaum, which is a common spot for his teaching. I say he and his disciples. I can't say specifically if this is as they get back off the boat on the other side. I don't necessarily mean that. But the scene is back to Capernaum. This picture should look somewhat familiar. I think it's the 3rd time that I have shown you this. Anybody know what or remember what this is? This is today what that looks like. It's the remnants, yes, it's the remains, the synagogue there at Capernaum. And we're going to, this is sort of where almost anything that Jesus does in Capernaum centers around the synagogue. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in just a second. But once again, there's a crowd of people amongst him. Jairus, who's one of the rulers of the synagogue, he was prominent in the community, and he will approach Jesus here in this story. So it's not Jesus coming to him, but rather him coming to Jesus. And Jairus is begging Jesus to come to his house and heal his dying daughter. And so that's the basis of where our story sort of centers around there. But I want to talk a little bit about this building. I've referenced it, and I want to talk a little bit about this one, but not so much this one, but just the concept or the idea of synagogues in general. We're seem a little slow on the click there. We might need to replace them. Already replaced them. Sometimes it just catches. So we use this word synagogue quite a bit. I've asked you before, and you all have said that a synagogue sort of is a church of people. The reality is that that's correct today. But originally, the synagogue was simply the term used for an assembly of Jews with the purpose of worship. But that should be very similar to church in Christianity, because how often do we refer to this building as the church? I mean, that's if you were to say, if somebody were to ask you, where do you go to church? You would say the Stanford Church of Christ, and then they would say, tell me about it. And you're like, well, it's a brick, you're going to fall into that descriptor pretty quick. But what is the church? It's the people. It's the people. How many of you all remember for a year or so, the Stanford Church of Christ met up there? Depot is where it was. Jill, why were they meeting at the depot? Didn't have this building. So that made that, it was less of an organization up there, right? No, not at all. It was still the church, right? It was just happened to meet there because this building was being remodeled. We have known, and you're all familiar with places that have been hit by tornadoes and hurricanes, and they have to meet in another place. I think you all, the Gatlinburg Church of Christ burned a few years ago, and they had to meet in different places. That did not affect the church. The church was the people there within, but this is the setting. The term synagogue originally was the assembling of the Jews, but it has come to become the name of the Jewish place of worship. And so if you were to drive by a place where there was a Jewish synagogue, you would refer to the synagogue, and that's the building, the same way that we tend to refer to the church as the building here. Synagogues were built in any village that had 10 men willing to assemble and worship. Okay? So if you're thinking 10 men, then you're probably going to say that most synagogues would have served at least how many people? 30 people, 40 people, depending on the size of the family. Well, is that not pretty similar to what a church is sort of like, in the way a congregation, maybe I should choose the word here today? A lot of congregations will start small, but it would be, if there was enough people willing to start one, then they would start. Yeah. Yeah. No, they're two different things. Yeah, two different things. The synagogue is a place of worship. The temple is more the gathering setting of people. Let's go a little further. In New Testament, by the time the New Testament comes around, services in the synagogue, and it's a Jewish service, and this would have been what Jesus would have been familiar with as well, included reading of the law and the prophets. So that's going to be, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. It's going to be prophets there within the Old Testament, or what we refer to the Old Testament as well. It would have included prayers. It would have included preaching. Tell me what sounds familiar about bullet point number 1. What? Almost all of it, right? How does bullet point look real similar? Bullet point 1 look real similar to what we do, right? When we come together, we read from the Bible, right? We have prayers. We have people speak. It's kind of the same thing. I've asked this. We talked a little bit about this. I don't know if it was on Wednesday night, but maybe on Sunday or whatever. But a lot of Christianity looks very similar to a lot of Jewish worship as well, in part because who were the early Christians? How many of you have ever heard the saying, there's no need to reinvent the wheel? Well, if you go in and change everything, people get, let's do it the same way, but we're just approaching it perhaps a little bit different. Ruler of the synagogue was one of the elders, that word should look familiar, who managed the affairs of the synagogue. Some had several rulers. That depended a lot of times on the size of the congregation, if we want to use that word as well. Rulers oversaw the services, appointed one who would conduct prayers, one who preached for the assembly. Does this sound familiar? It really sounds a whole lot. So all of these things that early Christianity adopts is really just Judaism sort of brought into a modern sense. I've said this before. Christianity started as a sect of Judaism. Right. Uh-huh. Sure.
We're going to find it. That's the same thing. That's how Jesus got to bring Scripture.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Here are just some pictures of, I've tried to make it where you can see everything. I couldn't do it perfectly, but this first one is called the Central Synagogue. It's in Aleppo in Syria, built about the 5th century AD. So these are after Christianity had already started, but you get a sense of sort of what it was. This one, as you can see sort of right here, it's outdoors. I don't know if it was originally outdoors or if the roof is just gone from it, but it has a very Roman look to it with those arches and that. The one up at the top, it's called the Old Synagogue in Erfurt, Germany. It is the oldest intact synagogue building in Europe. It is roughly 1100 AD. So that's the oldest building. The one in the bottom here, this is the Turo Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. It's the oldest synagogue in the United States, built in 1763. It was to this congregation after the American Revolution that George Washington wrote to them and said that Jewish people would be welcome to worship in the United States with the same freedom that Christians would have as well. There's plenty of old pictures of synagogues throughout that you could find. I just want to pick 3 that kind of hit on that. Any questions about synagogues before we go any further? Sure. Very much so. You can find pictures of one of those. You can find them in the United States that are extremely nice. You can find some that look like just a regular building, not unlike churches. There are churches that you see that are big and grand and fancy, and there are churches that are an outbuilding, basically, with the door that people will go in. Other questions or comments on synagogues? Well, I wanted you to be able to get a sense of that. We're going to talk about Jairus' daughter. And I mentioned a minute ago that she's dying, and Jairus, this ruler, this elder, this leader of the synagogue, approaches Jesus asking for help. And so Jesus will respond to her in kind, and we'll see that here in just a second. But he begins to accompany Jairus to their home. But whenever they're on their way, a woman comes in contact with them, has an issue of blood, touches the garment again. We'll talk about all that next week. This is an artistic drawing, but the city with X is a drawing of what it's like. Now, if you look at the size of this city, what do you notice about these homes here? They're fairly close together. This is most likely the synagogue. I don't know exactly, but I would imagine being there in the city. But when Jesus and Jairus are going to Jairus' house, I have no idea where Jairus' house is. But if let's say that Jairus' house is right here, what do you got to do to get from there to there? You got to meander through. What's going to happen if you walk from point A to point B? What's going to happen as you're walking through there? You're going to come in contact with other people. Think about the amount of people that you see if you start in the food section at Walmart and you make your way all the way over to the other side where the outdoor stuff. How many of you have ever went to Walmart to get 3 things and 3 hours later you finally back home? Why, right? Why does that happen? We stop and talk. So what we're going to see here is that Jesus will be pulled away, will be asked questions, will be distracted, whatever, on the way to Jairus' house. I'll plug this in here because if you're Jairus and you're going to your home where your daughter is dying and Jesus stops and talks along the way, what are you probably thinking? Let's go. It'd be different if we're going home for food, but we're going home for a child, for somebody who is dying. But exactly. And again, like Ben said right there, Jairus he's not just some random person. He's a high-ranking regular person. They're a high-ranking elder leader in the synagogue there as well. But he asked Jesus, and really all he can do is wait. So I wanted to see a few things there before we started. We have some old artwork again, raising the daughter. Jairus. I don't think this one's been stolen, so it's good. But it's pretty old, 1546 in the Louvre. You ever been there? No. Yeah, it originally was a palace, I think, and it turned into a museum. So this is where the Mona Lisa is, if you're ever in that area of the world. So let's talk a little bit about Mark chapter 5. We're going to read some, we're going to skip, and then we're going to read a little bit more. Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 24. Dad, you care to read this one?
And when Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a great multitude gathered to him, and he was by the sea. And behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue came, Jairus by name. And when he saw him, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, saying, My little daughter lies at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be healed, and she will live. So Jesus went with him, and a great multitude followed him and brought him.
All right. So, like we said, we introduced this. We sort of started it there a second ago, but Jairus comes up to Jesus with this daughter who is near death. So, first of all, I know we've already talked about it, but I just got to set the groundwork here again. Who was Jairus, first of all? Ruler of the synagogue. And so, as Ben said a minute ago, the ruler of the synagogue, sort of a leader within the community, he might have had a little bit more pull, right? If his thought might have been, I can approach Jesus and he'll come to me. Why does he come to Jesus for? It wants his daughter to be healed. And this is not somebody that wants to be healed that is in his congregation or that is his next door neighbor. But this is going to be a little bit more important. For what reason? It's his daughter. That's going to mean even more. I'm not saying that he doesn't want the person beside him or the person in the, but this means even more to him right there. Okay. Specifically, verse 23, what did he ask Jesus? You need to look in here. All right. He begs him earnestly. He says, come and lay your hands on her that she may be healed, and she will what? And she will live. So he's saying, come and lay your hands on her. Now, not, and not hopefully it'll happen, because we've seen that, right? We've seen miracles in this study where it didn't require Jesus to go all the way there. But he has specifically asked Jesus to go to his house. I don't know why he did it. We can all come up with our own reasons, but he has asked Jesus to come to lay hands on her that she would be A, healed, and B, that she would live. That is the specific question that he asked of them. Uh-huh. But I kind of get it, because I would think that if you asked, and this is a lack of faith, but if you asked and he said it's taken care of, and you went home and she wasn't, you might would have said, oh, but what if he had come? But you're exactly right. We do kind of feel like we need to do this, we need to do this. Sometimes that does happen right there. Now, any other thoughts on this? Because this is our last question, because I want to go to Luke. Yes. Sure. Right. Right. Sure. Well, and by this point, this is our 15th lesson. We've seen Jesus heal in a lot of different ways. I don't know how news traveled, how information traveled, but I'm suspecting, like you, he probably had heard of Jesus. He wouldn't have come and asked otherwise, but it's also likely that he may not have known all the details. Sometimes we kind of know a story, but don't necessarily know all the details. Mary. Absolutely. Let's go to Luke chapter 8. It's only 2 verses. We're not going to be in Luke for much. I just want to get a couple of things there. So if you want to stay in Mark, Luke chapter 8 is here on the board as well. Linda Denham, you care to read that one for us, please? Verse 41 and 42. Now, I wanted to hit on this because Mark doesn't give the detail that Luke does right here. But there's a couple of questions maybe to consider. Luke adds a couple of observations. One, he says that she was his only daughter, right? Second, she's about 12 years old. Why do you think, do those facts matter? And why or why not? Absolutely. Why else might these facts matter? Right. Absolutely. And so, yeah.
I think it shows that Luke is a doctor. That that's what a doctor needs to know. I mean, that's what. How old is she?
Right.
What's her situation?
And we talked about this. We mentioned this, I think, last week, that Mark kind of speeds through everything. The book of Mark is shorter, and it's like, then this happened, then this happened, and this happened. Then they went there. And you get a little bit more detail right here. It absolutely matters. It matters for relevant knowledge, but it also matters for, if his oldest daughter, if she's the fifth of 7 daughters and she's 48 years old, then he throws a lot of questions. Well, wonder why she's, well, had she done this? She's the only daughter. She's 12 years old. And how do you think that would have made Jairus feel? Absolutely. It's sort of, there's a level of panic, like you said, that's right there. So I wanted to look at Luke's version there just for a second before we go back to Mark. Any other thoughts on the facts about the daughter? Okay, so let's go further. This is Mark chapter 5, and I want us to look at verses 35 through 39 right now, 35 through 39. Mary, do you care to read that? All right. Now, at the end of what Luke wrote, at the end of Mark chapter 5, verse 24, I think it was, 23, they said that Jesus had been followed by a large group of people. This is not uncommon. We've seen this quite often. Why do you think this large group of people is going to follow Jesus toward Jairus' house? They want to see. There's a little rubbernecking going on here, a little bit of nosiness right here, a little bit of, I've heard about this guy. Maybe I want to see a little bit more about what's going to take place. Now, we have skipped a few verses here about the woman with the issue of blood. Okay. Like I said, we'll come back to that next week. But there's been a little bit of time that has lapsed between when Jairus first talked to Jesus and now when Jesus is finally going to get there. So let's consider a couple of things here. Jesus is still speaking to the afflicted woman in verse 35. Again, that's next week's topic. But he's talking to her. What news does Jairus receive from his house? That the daughter is dead. This probably would not have been unexpected news based on what appears to be her health condition there at the time. But they show up, and the person in verse 35 says what to Jairus? He doesn't just say your daughter's dead, but he says what? Don't trouble him. Why are you bothering him? They've already passed away. But Jesus speaks in verse 36. This is the first time we see Jesus. Speak. In verse 36, he says what to Jairus? Do not be afraid, only believe. So now you've got sort of conflicting stories, right? Because Jairus has been told by the people who have come from there, what? She's dead. But the person that he actually sought out to ask for help is saying what? Don't be afraid. And he says, only believe, right? So don't be afraid, only believe. Now, that's interesting then, as he just said, it's almost like, I'll take care of it. He doesn't say, don't be afraid, go home and lay out a pallet on the floor, get 3 gallons. He doesn't say any of that kind of stuff. He says, just just believe. What's he saying there when he says, don't be afraid, but believe? He's saying, trust it, that Jesus would take care of it. Now, you got a large crowd, a lot of people. Verse 37, who does Jesus allow to accompany him when he gets to the home? He said, Peter, James, and John. Now, you see these names quite often. And I have a little bit of information here that I want to discuss with us before we go any further. But clearly, Jesus is sort of narrowing down who all's going to be able to go in with him. First of all, let's think about that. Why do you think Jesus said, y'all stay out here, Peter, James, and John come with me? I have no scriptural basis for this answer. This is strictly an opinion.
I think because these three in particular had a special role to hold, and Jesus knew that there was going to be special strength with Peter, opening the door, kind of leading the charge of the church, the first sermon and everything else. John will be the oldest leader. Will have some of the most stringent challenges of setting up the churches and performing the one. These three had a very hard role, and Jesus knew they needed extra.
Ben took all the good answers right there. Those were all very good. So, any other thoughts on it? True. And if there's a million people, if you can't even turn around, that's kind of and that's in a sense what had happened with the woman with the issue of blood, although we didn't read about it. Yes. Uh-huh. Well, again, there's no way to really know one way or the other. Like I said, I think Ben took a lot of the good answers. What you're saying is purely hypothetical, but it makes, or speculative, I should say. But in Luke chapter 5, we see that Peter, Andrew, James, and John were the first four that were asked to be disciples. No Andrew here. No Andrew mentioned in this. Only Peter, James, and John. True, that's true. That's true. These three, just a couple of things. They would be the eyewitnesses of the transfiguration in Mark chapter 9. They'll witness Jairus' daughter being raised, and they'll be with him in the Garden of Gethsemane as well. So there's clearly some sort of relationship between these three people and Jesus. How many of you have been in the hospital? Maybe you've been an actual patient, or maybe you've known somebody that's in a difficult situation. And when the doctor comes in, there may be one or two people with him. They might not bring in all 100 nurses and extra doctors and all that, right? Why is the doctor and one or two people coming in right now? Learning. What else? It's a critical time right there. This is the most important time. Sometimes you're in there and it's really nothing, you're kind of got something wrong with you, but it's not that end of the world. And they just come rolling in one right after another. Well, that's maybe not the critical time right there. And I think you can see here this sort of critical times of Jesus, that these were the three that were with him as well. Peter would, as you said, preach the first gospel sermon, sort of opened the door. James was the first to be apostle to be killed. John will be the last to die as well. Again, I just wanted to mention that because it feels like a lot of times poor Bartholomew never gets mentioned, as much as all the rest, right? What occurs as they come into Jairus' house in verse 38? A lot of weeping, a lot of wailing, a lot of commotion right here in verse 38. They saw a tumult was the word that was used right there. Lots of people crying there. Right. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. Right. Maybe looking for down the road to say, when your daughter died, I was right there. There's people that will unfortunately do that as well. Let's go a little further. Mark chapter 5. This is verse 40 through 43. This will be Jesus actually healing. Boo, can you read this for us? Mark 5, 40 through 43. All right. Now, we read verse 40 right here, but I do want you to look back at verse 39 in your Bible real quick. He said, why make this commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping. Okay. How did the crowd react when Jesus told them the child is not sleeping? I want you to look just the first handful of words in verse 40 right there. So they laughed. Does yours say laughed? Mine says ridiculed. Does anybody say anything else? Laughed or ridiculed? I think that laughing almost like as a mocking, right? Is that how you would view that? But they sort of laughed, they ridiculed whatever here takes place. But Jesus puts them out right there. He says, he doesn't say it, but in a sense, he says, you're going to stay out. Because in verse 40, who goes into Jesus to the place where the child actually was? Father and mother, Peter, James, and John. So he says he took the father, the mother, the child, and those who were with him, and entered where the child was lying. So in a sense, we've been beyond the curtain. We're only taking the most relevant people right there. And he says, when Jesus takes the girl by the hand, he says to her what in verse 41? He says, little girl, I say to you, arise. Now, he had said earlier there, Talitha Kumai, and this is Aramaic, is translated for there. Just a real quick thoughts on Aramaic. It was the most common language for people living there at the time. Most likely Jesus spoke Aramaic. And that would have probably been his first language. Hebrew as a language, we think about Hebrew as a Jewish language, but more people spoke Aramaic than did Hebrew. But Aramaic is a Semitic language, just like Hebrew is, just like Arabic is today. Aramaic is the one that's sort of gone. There's still Hebrew. A lot of Jewish people still speak Hebrew. A lot of people in Israel do. And then Arabic is what, if you've anywhere around Egypt, Syria, Iraq, that's all going to be speaking Arabic. But they're all languages from the same sort of family right there. Point being that when Jesus spoke this, when he said Talitha Kumai to this girl, to her family, they would have understood what he was saying right there. He was saying, little girl, arise. Now in verse 42, how does she respond? Yes.
I think I read before studying that Mark uses that Aramaic about 4 different times. He's really telling the gospel.
Yes.
And that's the actual word.
He's the only one of the this is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He's the only one. Okay. What does the little girl? How does the girl? What does the girl do in response to what Jesus says? She arose, she walked, and then now Mark. I know we went ahead into Luke, but Mark mentions it now in verse 42. He says, "For she was 12 years. For she was 12 years of age." Now, Jesus then in verse 43 says what? Give her something to eat, and what else? Don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. Interesting, right? So we've seen, again, Jesus sort of revert back to the don't tell anybody. Well, any thoughts on why Jesus might have said that? Keep in mind sort of what was happening around the house.
Because we know that they're going to try to kill Lazarus through the racism. They're going to try to wipe out all traces of any miracle that he did. And so Jairus goes around telling everybody about this. One, they're going to harm out of synagogue. And two, they may try to kill his little daughter.
Mary? That verse 42 says, verse 42, the girl arose and walked. And I think it's important that it says, for she's 12 years old. She's not an infant. She was a 12-year-old. She's the 12-year-old only daughter of the leader of the synagogue. Are people going to know her? So when she walks out, they're not going to say, well, I've never seen that person before, or, oh, it was a newborn, and that stuff gets confused. But it's going to be the 12-year-old daughter who they thought was dead, who they all absolutely knew, and she's going to get up and walk right out of there. The proof is going to be in the pudding. Like Mary said, you're going to realize, wait a minute, 30 minutes ago, I was mocking them saying, oh, she's already dead. And now here she comes right there. It's going to put sort of a surprise into the crowd who's on the outside of the door, right? They didn't get to go in. They're just going to see her that they have all said was dead. They're going to see her walk out right then and there. Thoughts on what we saw here with Jairus' daughter?
I've always thought, Jesus tells these people, don't tell them, don't tell them, don't tell them. And he knows they're going to tell him. But he wants to maybe keep it down a little bit because he says he was thronging the people.
Yeah.
They would have loved to have a revolt that day and said, we're going to take over, the Roman Empire, run you guys out. That's what they were looking for, was an earthly king. Jesus was never intent to be the earthly king. And if those people had their way, then that might have snowballed into something, a big revolt. And I mean, there's been a lot of people killed, and Jesus would have done something miraculous to stop that from happening.
Could have.
And I've read one of those studies at one time that the reason he told them to give her something to eat and drink is because they still wasn't convinced that she was alive, she was okay.
Right.
He's like, look, this is no ghost, this is no trick, this is her, she's alive. You can figure, watch her eat, spirits don't eat or drink or whatever.
Right.
So Jesus, they still couldn't kind of wrap their mind around it or believe what Jesus had done.
Right. Again, all of those, I think every single time the question is asked, why did Jesus say to tell? Why did Jesus say not to tell? Is purely speculative. We cannot answer that question at all. I don't know why Jesus didn't want it told. It doesn't make sense to me that today it was yes and tomorrow it's no. Sometimes to the Jews it was no, to the Gentiles it was yes. I think we're strictly guessing as to what it is. But when I've said this before, when we put ourselves into those spots, I don't know how we would, necessarily react to it. Connie, go ahead. I'm sorry. I think you're right. Right. He's not a magician doing tricks for the audience in a sense. Yeah. Other thoughts on this before we wrap up? Well, a few things to sort of leave with. And like I said, we skipped over the woman with the issue of blood, and we'll come back to her next week. But just know that happens sort of in between the synagogue and Jairus' house. That happens there within. The first thing, God cares for us and the things that weigh on our hearts. And I hope that we think about that, that we know that. We are probably all dealing with various things at various times. We're not the only people that are, right? But sometimes it may seem that we are because our friends and our relatives, maybe they don't have those kind of issues, but they have another issue that they're dealing with as well. But we know that God cares for us and those things that are weighing on us. God can restore what has been lost, broken, or died within us, right? Sometimes those things happen. Now, I was reading something in sort of thinking about these lessons to leave with. And the thing that I read, it was written by a woman, and it was geared toward young girls, like middle school and high school girls. And it was a thing about like, your boyfriend has broken up with you. And the thing was like, that is the most traumatic thing in the world for a 14, 15-year-old girl. But the point of the lesson was, the point of the thing that I was reading there was sometimes we need those things to sort of happen to grow from them, right? And they said, for these young girls that this was happening, it's the worst thing in the world, but they're going to learn from this, and hopefully their next relationship, they'll pick somebody better, or the relationship will be better, or whatever it might be. You can write this for anybody. That you're not a 14-year-old girl, but you've got other issues that maybe bad things, or maybe these things that sort of happen can hopefully be restored. What did Mary and Martha say when Lazarus died? When Jesus first gets there, and essentially what do they say when he gets to the door? If you'd been here, this wouldn't have happened. But what had Jesus done? I know Lazarus is still a few weeks away. What had Jesus specifically done? They had delayed for 2 days. In a sense, I think Jesus did that for a reason, right? They realized what was missing with their brother being dead. They also realized what Jesus could do for them there as well. And I wonder what kind of emotions Mary and Martha went through for 2 days before Jesus got there. Well, Yeah. Perhaps he was handling it a little differently than we would have expected it to have been. Jesus asked us to do what? Trust him, right? What did he say to Jairus? Don't be afraid, only believe. What do you think Jairus thought when they got to the house after they'd made a stop along the way? They get to the house and everybody is mocking Jesus and Jairus too, right there. What do you think Jairus thought? Do you think that would have been a challenge to his faith? Probably so. Who knows? The evidence would seem to say that this girl was dead. But don't be afraid. Just believe. Absolutely. Against a lot of other people who were not doing the same thing that he was doing right there. He asked that they trust. And she was saved. She was healed. She was made whole. Sure. And he sought out Jesus. And I'm sure Jesus was in and around the synagogue, and he was too, but he sort of sought it out. So just a few things there to take with us. Any thoughts before we wrap up tonight? This was an interesting lesson, an interesting story to see. We're about halfway through the end, through the different miracles that Jesus has performed. And I hope we've seen that there's not really a rhyme or reason to any of them. There's a lot of different things there within these lessons as well. So, any other thoughts? Like I said, next week we will talk about the woman with the affliction there, and we'll deal with that again. That was sort of interlapping or intertwined with this story as well. Thank you so much.